Hello, I am David Mitchell. I'm a professor in the Department of English at George Washington University. And today I want to offer up a keynote speech on William Vollmann's Fathers and Crows, which is a very significant novel published in the early 1990s, 1993. And it's largely a retelling of the violence of French settler colonialism on the eastern seaboard of Canada. The title of the paper is We Make Holocausts, Indigenous Models of Peripheral Embodiment in William T. Vollmann's Fathers and Crows. So I hope you enjoy the presentation. This essay analyzes the fraught relationship between representations of disability and the precarity born in processes of global colonialism. To undertake this project, we analyze reputations of disability in William T. Vollmann's Fathers and Crows, published 1993. Vollmann's massive historical novel reaches back from its contemporary settings in the 1980s, Montreal, to exhume myriad past violence wrought by European conquests, the continuing effects of colonialism in the Americas, and its attendant genocidal impact. I consider Vollmann's novel as an example of resistance literature in that it offers creative reimaginings of first contact and seeks to archaeologically unearth the ruins of history, the incomplete erasure of Indigenous practices, cultures, and lives. In particular, resistance literature seeks to understand Indigenous agency, the idea that the world is a social construction and that the ways that we interact with it influence that construction. My analysis of disability precarity endeavors to show how the remnants of historical dispossession have both shattered Indigenous lives, impaired the health of colonized populations, brought death-dealing practices to previously sustainable Indigenous communities, and threatened to destroy the world for even present-day survivors of various colonial projects. At the same time, disability functions as a tool to gesture toward future worlds where the innovations of alternative, non-normative mappings of ethical living occur. This chapter's centering term, precarity, takes up Judith Butler's theorization by examining details of what constitutes the conditions of precarity, and in turn applying them to Indigenous disability conditions. My goal here is to map some ways in which disability offers, quote, alternative ethical maps of living, end quote, in works of indigeneity opposed to the imposition of Euro-American sovereignty. Fathers and Crows, although not a novel written by an Indigenous writer, draws heavily from historical archives, still surfacing in the longue durée of Indigenous experiences. By using the term precarity, Butler calls for the insight on injury, quote, namely that there are others out there on whom my life depends, end quote. This defining fundamental interdependency of all embodied beings often reveals the tragic irony that there are ways of distributing vulnerability through differential forms of allocation that make some populations more subject to arbitrary violence than others. In this chapter, we use the phrase peripheral embodiment as an imposition of inferiority on Indigenous and/or disabled people by hierarchical systems of the human perpetuated under colonial, post-colonial, and settler colonial rule. The key bridge between these two terms, indigeneity and disability, form the nexus of the depreciations of primitivism and its incumbent concept of inbuilt biological incapacity that mutually disqualified the original inhabitants of a colonized space. Next section is called Indigenous Models of Precarious Embodiment. William Vollmann's work offers a wide-ranging historical recovery project of the devastating impact of varying forms of colonialism on Indigenous people. Its framing structure shows that what at first appears to be stories of individual suffering and disablement due to inferior biologies as professed by the colonizers proved to be in fact the long-standing residual results of historical violence, dispossession of the land, the slaughter of non-human animals as sustainable resources, destruction of fragile ecosystems, and the annexation of indigenous forms of sovereignty. Significantly for our purposes here, these works deploy representations of disability as the misrecognized marker of precarity, born of beliefs of inbuilt inferiority among vulnerable populations. In contrast, their primary tactic of representation is to show how individual group precarity is the product of erased histories of destruction and dispossession experienced by indigenous populations in their now post-colonial contemporary worlds. None of these works avoid the risky encounter with the particularities of impairment. Thus, they break from social model traditions developed within disability studies and partake in the return to the body or the return of ontology methodologies of crip queer studies. Instead, their in-depth diagnostic investigations into personal symptomatology offer a way to push through the sleeve of impairment as a passageway through the refuse of contemporary life to wider colonial histories of precarity. Thus, whereas the social model of disability might formulate the problem as encounters with discrimination imposed on top of individual impairment, these investigations into the precarity of indigenous body minds go beyond the expose of inbuilt systemic oppression to the global expanse of historical effects symptomatically surfacing in today's native peoples. We call this foundational representational tactic of contemporary indigenous literature indigenous models of precarious embodiment in contemporary literature of the Langue de Ré. Non-human animal holocaust. William T. Vollmann's Fathers and Crows traces the introduction of iron through the trading of plows, hinges, and guns as a further key devastating source of desire and disease transmission in Ihonatiria, the lands of the Haudenosaunee and the Iroquois, by French settler colonialists. The northeastern world of Native American peoples is decimated by disease. Vollmann's Americanized narrator approaches the destruction through his own satirized imposition of primitivism. According to William the Blind, quote, "So it was on this spot, Quebec, which a mere 3.5 decades since had been rocky wilderness of screeching savages. Now it was reclaimed, and the Jesuit missionaries had little reason to fault the improvement," end quote. The massive transmission of measles, influenza, smallpox, and other communicable diseases from Europe resulted in the devastation of a population estimated at 2 million before European contact. Yet as the work's glossary timeline states, by 1660, the Cayuga are estimated at 1,500, the Micmac at 2,200, and the Five Nations at 16,000. The transmission upswing in disease and death results from increasing contact with French and British colonials, whose ever-escalating demand for beaver pelts introduces new practices of mass killing of non-human animal species and the inattention to agricultural husbandry by formerly non-nomadic people. Increases in the productivity of non-human animal killings occur throughout the novel following the introduction of more lethal iron weaponry, such as axes, swords, and spear tips. The fur trade gave fuel to an unprecedented slaughter of beaver that expanded from 12,000 to 15,000 beaver furs in 1612 to 30,000 pounds by 1645. Thus, native peoples decimated a key animal resource to meet European demands and gain ever greater access to iron products introduced from Europe, such as copper kettles and Dutch door hinges. This incessant trade of baubles for animal hides produces massive genocidal effects beyond the decimation of animal lives and essentially enlists indigenous peoples as agents of destruction of their own environment. Beaver extermination crashed the sustainable resource upon which native peoples relied and had cultivated for thousands of years. The obsessive hunt for beaver furs to satisfy European demand for pelts shifted indigenous practices from that of a stable agrarian community relying upon careful stewardship of the land and crops toward a more nomadic, violent relation to non-human animals. Beaver kill rates ran up to extinction levels within 3 decades. By 1630, for example, the Wendats had hunted the beaver in their area to complete extinction. Indigenous peoples of northeastern America proved not only susceptible to European diseases, but they also grew increasingly subject to malnutrition-related disease. Thus, non-human animal holocausts led to increasingly lethal forms of intertribal warfare and the loss of sustainable proteins as indigenous tribes war with each other for dwindling food supplies. Vollmann identifies that between 1634 and 1640, the Hurons lost more than half of their population to war, disease, and famine. Consequently, Fathers and Crows outlines a parallel route to the reshaping of Native societies through its key thematic focus on the destruction of indigenous lives due to the growing appetite for iron planted in the imaginations of young indigenous males, most particularly. Given that one of copper's most prized possessions as a precious metal is its malleability, Vollmann turns its sparkling claim on desires into a mortality-dealing metaphor for how European expansion ideologically overwhelmed Native consciousness. Quote, when the Iron People came into the land and all 5 nations of the Iroquois and Haudenosaunee began to crave iron goods as once lovers had craved lovers, we want iron and iron, but we do not have skins and skins to give these Iron People in exchange. And it seems to me that this iron is a kind of poison, for by its very convenience, it will make us lazy and dependent upon these Iron People. Vollmann's Rodnier, an advisor from the select lineage of chiefs, exposes the destructive nature of indigenous thirst for iron. He advises a restoration of their previous agrarian practices, combined with sustainable hunting and fishing practices that result in neither animal holocausts nor in the loss of sustainable crops. The Rodnier speech employs iron both for its seductive, shiny malleability of iron's materiality, and also as a metaphor for European weaponization of iron as one that has reformed indigenous peoples' mindsets and turned them into slaughterers of their own sustainability. Thus, They are in danger of becoming part of the object world that Europeans mark as the evidence of their indigenous precarity of embodiment and enlightenment. Thus, Vollmann lays out his multi-pronged thesis of the problem with iron. One, it makes the work of tilling too easy and cultivates the recipient's laziness and failing responsible stewardship of the land. Two, guns, spears, hatchets, axes, and iron swords kill animals too quickly and empty the forests of key food sources that drive toward extinction outcomes. Three, seeking iron exposes tribes to disease as the desire to trade results in the letting down of barriers and the infiltration of European traders and missionaries into tribal villages. 4. The desire for iron deflects from long-standing practices of planting and cultivating by orienting native peoples toward only killing animals for accumulation. 5. The rise of lethal weapons increased the risk of genocidal outcomes, including their own. And 6, nomadism accelerates and destabilizes indigenous agrarian-based communities that have underwritten tribal survival for millennia. In Vollmann's novel of European settler colonialism, incapacity is revalued as a form of non-normative capacitation. Near the conclusion, Vollmann's aptly named narrator, William the Blind, exposes the indigenous logic of the productiveness of disability. After a history of multiple refusals to allow European missionaries into indigenous villages, a key recognition forms among Native observers. Non-afflicted tribes are those who have abjured from contact with Jesuit missionaries. As the next generations begin to die off in massive numbers and conversion to Christianity seems inevitable, a long lineup of indigenous people forms outside of the loghouse of the Jesuit missionaries, who have now wormed their way into many indigenous communities. The Jesuits baptized the dying, disabled, and dead, those who now comprise the majority of the remaining indigenous populations following decades of contact with Europeans. Stoke the numbers of conversions that they plan to document in reports to Paris about their theological successes in bringing Native peoples to a more obeisant Christian conversion, and at the same time ironically convert only those who will not survive for more than a day or two. This carrion bird-like practice of the Jesuit priests underscore Butler's argument about precarity as making some populations more vulnerable than others. The realization of what Father Brebeuf refers to as the black gown's profession of making holocausts against a savage people reveals that there is no truth for indigenous people to assimilation, even through theological conversion. They are forever savages, and conversion remains a largely theoretical affair. Thus, the mass baptism of the dying, ill, and disabled performs an administrative function only. It leaves the Jesuits assured in their continuing cultural superiority through the residual convenience of not having to deal with those brown bodies. The Jesuits' mark is incapable of transcending from their defining primitivism, characterized by the biological inferiority within. The one partial indigenous half-breed exception to French Christianity through assimilated sainthood is the airbrush statue and stained glass non-disabled portrait of Catherine Tekakwitha, who now serves as a token to Jesuit conversion. Catherine, who has weak eyes and who was marked by, quote, smallpox that cratered her face, end quote, is pockmarked by smallpox and whose body is scarred by the Jesuit practice of self-ablation. takes a canoe ride with her Indigenous consorts down the St. Lawrence River from Indian Territory to join the Jesuit monasterial order in Montreal. As one whose vision and body has been compromised by contact with French missionaries, and who has none of the gifts of the novel's Indigenous protagonist born swimming, who can see into the future and who predicts the arrival of the first French settlers and the disaster it will become, Tekakwitha feels the hand of one of the Indigenous paddlers on her shoulder and asks hopefully, "Is it the city of Montreal beautiful?" The paddler responds falsely to her question with, "Yes, child, very beautiful." As the canoe makes its way through discarded trash and human waste that the Europeans dump into the river as their all-purpose sewer without regard for the environmental destruction it produces, the coupling of this chapter's key elements of disability precarity, blindness, pockmarked face, and bodily scars, the pollution of the waterways and airways of a once pristine environment, the holocausts of deaths for non-animal and indigenous human populations alike, all converge in Catherine's figure as the ironic icon of reverence, who is assumed into sainthood as her disabilities are airbrushed away during efforts to diminish the violence of Canadian colonization in the contemporary sentimental myth of 1980s Montreal. Since disabilities do not serve the romance of national histories, they are erased. It is the erasure of disability markers and also her half-breed status that qualifies her as a semi-palatable candidate for nationalist statehood. Her willing conversion serves the national narrative of Canada by showing the Indigenous people's willing desire for Frenchification. Conclusion. These historical rewritings of the precariousness of Indigenous peoples under Western colonialism forwards disability as a reliable guide to the revelation of the falsities of a nation's self-serving stories of conquest, adventure, and the rapine of Indigenous people. These sensorially, psychologically, and/or physically scarred figures ground Butler's theory of precarity in that they help to underscore the racial interdependency of embodied lives. Yet, whereas Butler leaves her theory largely as a marker of the ravages of vulnerability and the foundation stone of her argument about ungrievable lives, these historical novels also turn on the ironies of precarious Indigenous disabled lives as vehicles of potential transformation for the insights that attention to vulnerable embodiments entail. Rather than westernized, masculinist, cis-hetero independence, each subject's reliance on and rejection of the mortality-dealing actions of colonial others operates as, quote, the difference engine of an alternative map of ethical existence that might lead to a more sustainable hybrid indigeneity. Vollmann offers visions out of the refuse of Western colonialist despoilations of environments for humans and non-humans alike, that which disability studies and environmental theorist Sonora Taylor refers to as dead meat capitalism. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and I'll look forward to any questions in the follow-up period.